Welcome to the first episode of the Appetite PR App Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Rutherford. Stay tuned for my interview with Jacob Stevens. Jacob is the co-developer and co-designer of the very popular and unique new iPhone and iPad app, Pizza vs. Skeletons. Well, welcome to the inaugural episode of Appetite PR's App Marketing Podcast. I'm excited today to be talking to Jacob Stevens of Riverman Media, a small independent game studio in Tucson, Arizona. Jacob, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Sure. Well, so Riverman Media's latest game, which has been receiving a lot of attention in the app review press, and if I'm not mistaken, it was chosen as an app of the week by Apple. The name of the game is called Pizza vs. Skeletons. Yes, you heard that right. Pizza vs. Skeletons. And from personal experience, my sons are 8 years old and 4 years old, and my 4-year-old is in love with this new game, Pizza vs. Skeletons. Jacob, first, why don't you describe the game for listeners who haven't played it yet? And I would just encourage anyone who's listening to go and download the game and give it a try.
Sure. So the basic premise is exactly like the title sounds. You're a pizza and you're fighting skeletons. But in this case, you're a gigantic pizza. You're 20 feet tall. You're basically the height of the entire screen. And you're smashing skeletons in all sorts of different scenarios. Sometimes it's just sort of a gladiator style level where you're smashing them over flat terrain. In one level, you're sort of a wrecking ball and you're smashing skeletons that are in buildings or skyscrapers. You ski, you do all sorts of things. So you're a huge pizza smashing skeletons in a lot of different ways.
That's a great description. Well, before we talk more about Pizza vs. Skeletons, and we definitely will, I wanted to find out a little bit more about kind of your personal story. Things like, when did you first start programming games? And I wondered if you could remember a specific memory when you coded or made your first game and realized, oh, wow, I can not only play video games, but I can make my own games. So can you give us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got into game design and coding?
Sure. So I've always loved drawing and I've always loved music. And one Christmas, my grandfather got us a Nintendo Entertainment System and I never really played games before, but I got really into the classic titles like Mario, Duck Hunt, stuff like that. At that point, I knew that I wanted to make games, but obviously I was pretty young and I had no idea how. So I would draw a lot of ideas and stuff like that, but obviously wasn't really making games. My first experience coding was in my 4th grade class. My teacher, Mrs. Larson, had kind of identified that I was probably a bright kid, but wasn't trying my absolute hardest. And she would encourage me to do extra things if I finished assignments early or something like that. So in her class, we had 2 chances to take every spelling test. And if you got everything right on the first try, then you could have free time for the second try. So she would set me up on her old Apple II computer. And at first I would just play Oregon Trail or whatever during that free time. But so I started programming in BASIC after these spelling tests, and I realized that I could make simple games with that, like, do you want to go north or south? Yes, no, things like that. And obviously what I made was very, very simple, but at the time it made me realize that I could probably do this for a living. And that's my first experience coding. Later in life, around high school, I learned that DigiPen, which is a school that is either sponsored by or affiliated with Nintendo in Vancouver, had a summer program for high school students. And I went there and continued to learn to program games at an amateur level. And I met up with some friends late in high school, and they were in college, and they were into games, and I learned a lot from them about programming. And I actually mostly did art. And then I would say my first real professional experience was as an intern for a company called Way Forward. Their most prevalent title is probably Contra 4, which they did for the DS, and which I also worked on. So all through college, I would do actually art for them as opposed to coding. For whatever reason, that's just what they happen to need. And so after that, I sort of got scared, I guess you could say, and got concerned that games were not a stable enough career. I had graduated college, I needed money, so I took a job down in Tucson at IBM, and it was a great job, and I enjoyed it, but immediately I started missing the idea of making games. And coincidentally, my brother had just moved down to Tucson to go to the University of Arizona. He's about 4 years younger than me. And I said, we should make a game, because he was learning computer science as well. And that was when we made our first game, Cash Cow. I guess that was about 7 years ago. And he was still a freshman. He barely knew any programming. And so that was our first game, and we've just taken it one game at a time from there.
And so just to back up a minute, when you were doing the summer program, where did you grow up? Because you said you moved to Tucson. Did you grow up in Canada?
No, I grew up in Flagstaff, which is a small town about 4 hours north, maybe 5 hours north of Tucson in Arizona. Sure.
And when you did that summer program with DigiPen, did you go to Vancouver for the summer?
Yeah, I did. I happened to have a cousin that was getting married, so I just spent an extra 2 weeks up there for the summer program.
Gotcha. And what kind of platform were you programming on at that point? What kind of, was it PC or?
Yeah, it was actually Visual Basic on PCs. Even though the degrees you get from DigiPen, I think they work a lot with Nintendo platforms. For the summer students, I think that would have been too much. So we just did PC stuff.
Right. And so you said that your brother moved down with you, and you made Cash Cow, and you started going from there. Are you still working at IBM now, or is this full time for you?
I actually left IBM employment about a year and a half ago, but I had slowly been transitioning out. So after Cash Cow did decently well, I went to part-time at IBM 3 days a week. And then as our other games, some of them didn't do well, so I was glad I had stayed on. And then some did start doing really well. And so I transitioned out. But they have recently convinced me to actually do a little bit of consulting for them as a user interface designer. So
right. And so what kind of work were you doing at IBM? Were you doing just coding or art or UI?
Well, I started off as a coder because that's what my degree is in. But within about 2 weeks, I was identifying what I thought were usability issues with their web-based user interfaces. And I had a group of people who were hired around the same time as me, and they kind of had a sense of what a good user interface versus a bad one was. And we actually were sort of this mercenary team that would go around and overhaul user interfaces because IBM's great at making the guts of something, but at the time they hadn't yet really figured out how to make great user interfaces. So we would go around and we overhauled the front ends of these products. And it was very similar to making games. It's just, it was more serious, obviously, but you're thinking the same things, trying to guess what the user will do, what they will think when they see a screen, and trying to make it look nice.
Right. That's great. I'm glad to get that background. And And I want to talk about Pizza versus Skeletons. Can you kind of take us through through the development of the game? How did you come up with the idea, and did it start out as Pizza versus Skeletons? And I'm just curious about how it may have changed during the development process, and then finally, if you can talk a little bit about the programming tools you used in designing the game.
Sure. So I'll give you some background that very few people actually know. So we released our first iPhone game, which happened to be a port of our first game, Cash Cow. We made Cash Cow the absolute best iPhone game that we could, and it came out and it didn't really pay for its development. It did well compared to most other titles, but we were realizing that the App Store was so incredibly competitive that even the best games didn't necessarily have a guaranteed chance of success. So Paul and I were thinking, well, what can we do to kind of get the juices flowing, make sure we're earning money? So we started a fake company that we didn't want anyone to know who it was. We didn't want it to be associated with us in any way. And the point of that company was to make games in a month and publish them and just see how they would do relative to Cash Cow, which had taken a year. And the games that came out of that, which we now have made public are ours, are the games Space Frac, Deathfall, Icaros, and Fat Roll Santa. So those were all very small, fast projects for us.
And did you meet your goal of doing it in a month?
Yeah, so we actually did, and they made more money relative to the time they took than Cash Cow did, which was very encouraging to us. So the funny thing was, the fourth or fifth game idea was something I had blurted out and made a sketch of, called Pizza versus Skeletons. And it was intended to be this really small kind of throwaway gimmicky game where you're giant pizza smashing skeletons. But we realized that to do the concept justice, we couldn't make it one of these 1 month games. We realized we had so many ideas for it that we couldn't compress it into the development cycle for this fake company. So we put it on the back burner, and we did some other things. We did some contract work for Disney, actually, a game called Blackout. And when that was done, we kept coming back to this idea, which was really funny to us. Whenever we told our friends about it, they would laugh. Whenever I showed the picture to anyone, the little sketches I had made, people thought it was great. And we said, we know we can make money with these short games. Let's try again with a big project. And so we embarked on Pizza versus Skeletons, which took about 9 months.
Wow. And so what was kind of the deciding factor, or was there one, when you decided to pull the trigger and say, okay, we're going to do Pizza versus Skeletons?
I think honestly it was that both of us had this gut feeling that with such an unusual name and sort of an unusual layout of the screen, with a character that's the size of the screen and that's kind of a funny character, we just thought this might be the one that really pushes us over the top as far as a big project. And luckily that ended up being true. It was just a gut feeling, though.
That's great. Well, so what are some of the programming tools that you use when you're designing Pizza versus Skeletons, or that you did use?
I'm not the programmer. My brother is, but he hand rolls everything from scratch, mostly in C++ and just in Objective-C where he needs to. So we don't use any external engines like Unity or Cocos 2D. The only thing we do use, which we love, is Box 2D for the physics.
Right. Great. Well, has Pizza vs. Skeletons been your most popular game thus far in terms of downloads?
In terms of downloads, Cash Cow is still beating it, but a lot of a lot of those downloads, though, were free. In fact, I would say 95% were free because we signed a lot of deals for it early on that allowed it. We shouldn't have signed, but we didn't know better. That allowed it to be given away as promotional game or something like that. So, and also the way the casual game markets work, games are free to download, and then you pay like $20 if you want to play more than an hour. So we've had millions of downloads of Cash Cows, but in terms of sales, Pizza vs. Skeletons surpassed it within a couple weeks.
Gotcha. And since you've developed and published multiple games for iOS, what did you do specifically to market your earlier games, and what have you done thus far to market Pizza vs. Skeletons?
Paul and I are really bad marketers, and we're also purists. So we are kind of known amongst our friends for like doing a terrible job marketing and almost doing no marketing whatsoever. Our core business philosophy is very simple. If we're making the best 2D games in the world, then they will sell enough without us marketing them. And that's not to say that a great marketer wouldn't be able to make them sell more, but we feel that we should be focusing our energy on the game itself. And that's probably a bad business decision, but so for Pizza, what we did was very simple. We posted screenshots on a couple message boards, TigSource, which is an indie game site, and Touch Arcade, which is an iOS site. It really snowballed from there. Someone from Touch Arcade saw the posts and contacted us. The only sneaky thing that we did was we knew a guy from a company called Sunken Media who happened to have some contacts at Apple, and we gave them an early copy of the game. And you never know. I think that might have helped it become Game of the Week. They might have just liked it anyway. I really don't know how their internal process works, but that was really the biggest marketing move we made. And we actually didn't reach out to any sites for reviews. We didn't do anything except those two things.
Interesting. So have you ever spoken to anyone, or has anyone at Apple ever contacted you directly about the Game of the Week?
No, they contacted us through that friend I mentioned in California.
Right.
Who had given them the early copy. So I've never spoken to anyone at Apple about it.
Gotcha. So have you ever done any, I mean, I think probably the answer is no, but I want to ask anyway, have you ever done any kind of paid advertising, like pay per click for downloads?
Well, no, we never have.
And how were the free deals that you mentioned for Cash Cow? How did that come about? You were talking about the casual game market.
So a lot of sites on iPhone, there are several apps, freeappaday.com, I think, that will promote your game if you make it free for a few days.
Right.
And during the course of that time, you get maybe 50 to 100 times more downloads of your game. And it's really great for exposure. I will say that it doesn't always actually translate into sales once you make your game not free. Mm-hmm. And let me make a big caveat to that statement, which is that I think games that have in-app purchase probably benefit enormously from it. None of our games have in-app purchase, so it's not something I think that works quite as well for us.
Right. And so Pizza vs. Skeleton is priced at $2.99. Was there any kind of great thought put into that price point, or did you look at a specific game at that price point that made you think $2.99? What was the decision process behind that?
We watch the App Store very, very closely. Have you heard of a site called App Annie?
Yes.
it's a site that aggregates pretty much every piece of public data about the App Store. And so some things we were noticing were that if you're in, say, the top 25 charts, you're selling maybe 5,000 units a day. If you're, say, number 25 in games. Now, 5,000 units a day is pretty good, but at 99 cents, it's maybe only $3,500 or whatever.
Right.
And we also noticed that games that played around with their price point, if you're Infinity Blade and you go from $7 to $1, it makes a huge difference. But we also noticed that games that played with their price point going, say, from $3 to $1, it didn't always make a difference, nor when they raised the price after sale did it have quite as big an impact. And so that plus a little bit of insider knowledge from our friend in California who happened to know that between $1 and $3 doesn't seem to make a huge difference in terms of units. We realized we could be making 3 times more revenue at the $3 price point. And,
right.
And I'm very glad we did that. There are people who say you should have dropped it while you're Game of the Week and soared up the charts. And the thing is, when we did our calculation, even though we topped out at 27 in the charts, we were actually making as much revenue as the top 10 games because we were at $2.99. So that was a calculation we made, and I don't know what would have happened at 99 cents or at $5 or whatever, but I'm really glad I'm very happy with the price we did settle on.
Right. I'm curious, given what you were talking about of watching all of the publicly available app data and stats around the App Store, is there anything that frustrates you about the App Store or the app discovery process that if you had a wish list and Apple was listening, that you would say, you really should do this or that?
I wish I could say that I had specific recommendations for Apple, but there's absolutely a frustration that I have. And it's pretty simple. So I think Paul and I have really got a handle on how to get your app noticed during the first 2 weeks that it's out. We've gone from sort of basic featuring through Apple to as good a featuring as you can get. And to Apple's credit, I will say that it is the quality of the game that makes your launch. And that's really fantastic because that's definitely not true on every platform.
Sure.
And so we've always managed to have that great first 2 weeks. The problem is once you're out of Apple's sort of specialized featuring area, the sales almost immediately for all of our games go down literally to about 1% of what they used to be.
Wow.
And I would love to know how to change that, whether through actions that we can take or through the actions that Apple can take to extend those sales so that a game you worked a year on maybe might be selling copies for a year. I think that would be fantastic. And there might just be way too many games for that to be a reality, but I think it would tremendously help developers that put time and effort into their games so that they can derive a steady source of income from them beyond the 2 weeks that the game's launched in.
Sure. So kind of something like, some way of spotlighting, for the lack of a better word, kind of the long tail of games that are out there that are quality games that for the reasons that you've just touched on are not at the top of the charts because they've been out for 6 months.
Exactly. And I think the issue, there's a couple of issues. Number one, there's just a huge number of games coming out. And number two is the only real visibility that you have is when you're on those charts and basically in the top 50. So if you're not one of those 50 games and you're not in the launch window where Apple's featuring you, there's basically no way for anyone to find your game. It's just sort of lost in the cloud, literally and figuratively.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that makes sense, and it certainly echoes things that I've heard from other developers, both games and other types of apps.
Sure. And there are games that somehow defy those odds. Obviously, say a game like Tiny Wings is from a small developer and it's hung on a long time. But I would say the vast majority, you better sell a lot of copies in your first 2 weeks or you're not going to make any money.
Right. Interesting. Well, right now, Pizza vs. Skeleton is available for iOS. Any plans for an Android version?
Actually, we're in talks with Amazon and some Android developers to see what we could do there. I have no familiarity with the Android market at all. I've heard it's even tougher than iOS, but I want as many people to be able to play this as possible, so we're looking into it.
That's great. And so what's next for Pizzas versus Skeletons? Do you have plans for like a major update? What you're thinking along those lines?
We're making a small update right now that just addresses some minor issues, like people wanted a mute button so they could listen to podcasts. We're translating it into French, Italian, German, and Spanish. So that'll be the most immediate update. But we are planning a number of level packs depending on what the demand for the game is over its lifetime. We've already got sort of a new gameplay variation in the works and 10 more levels, and we have loose plans for up to 50 more levels.
Great. And obviously Pizza vs. Skeletons has had a lot of success as we've talked about. Have you and your brother started thinking about other games that you would hope to work on in the future?
We have started thinking about it. To be honest with you, my creativity has run so dry from putting everything I can into pizza. This is the first time in recent memory I can recall having really no ideas for a game. But I'm sure that's going to change in a week or two. So we haven't started anything serious, but we're definitely always looking ahead.
That's great. Well, I think that's all the questions I had. Any last thoughts on your part?
No, I really appreciate doing this podcast, and thanks to all the players out there for the tremendously positive response. We really appreciate it, and we hope you're enjoying the game.
Great. Well, again, people can download the game in the iTunes App Store. That's Pizza vs. Skeletons. It's a whole lot of fun. I definitely recommend downloading it and checking it out. Jacob, thanks for taking the time to do the interview.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the first episode of the Appetite PR App Marketing Podcast. If you're interested in what Appetite PR offers app developers, you can check it out at appetitepr.com. And stay tuned for more episodes of the App Marketing Podcast. We hope to be talking to many app developers about their app marketing experiences, what they've done that's worked, what hasn't worked, and their thoughts about app marketing. Thanks.